Hey guys, so this is our first video on evolution, and today we're going to be talking about speciation. So speciation is looking at how one species evolves into another species. So how we get this branching effect from one species into multiple species. The objectives of this presentation are to review what defines a species, to describe different barriers that keep species separated, to explain how one species diverges into two species, to define allopatric and sympatric speciation, and to discuss how artificial selection can lead to the evolution of a new species. So we already learned this in our ecology unit, but a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So as you see here, these are all meerkats, and one meerkat can reproduce with another meerkat to produce a fertile meerkat offspring. But we know sometimes that this isn't always the case. So there are some exceptions, like a lot of things in biology. So let's take for an example this liger. So a lot of you have heard of this, probably in Napoleon Dynamite. Sorry, I couldn't find a picture without a woman in it, but here's a picture of a liger. So you get a liger by breeding a female tiger with a male lion. And what you're going to get is this liger species. However, these two are separate species. So this liger is actually sterile. It cannot reproduce. So we know that a lion and a tiger are not of the same species because even though they're reproducing an offspring, that offspring is not fertile. So in order to be defined as a species, you have to reproduce offspring that can also reproduce themselves. So organisms like this are called a hybrid. So it's a mix between two different species. Okay, so how do we get a species? So speciation is an event that produces a separate species. So this is when a species is diverging from one into another. So, for example, we're starting with this original cat species. And this cat species has diverged into a house cat, a jaguar, a cheetah, a lion. So how does that happen? That's what we're going to be talking about in the next few slides. So the first thing is it requires something called reproductive isolation. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but it requires reproductive isolation. So what we're trying to figure out in the next few slides is how does one species diverge into two different species? What would cause that? So that's what we're going to focus on now. So the first thing we're going to talk about is something called allopatric isolation. And what that means is basically is a new species is arising due to geographic isolation. So when I talk about geographic isolation, I mean a physical barrier is separated between two populations. So they were originally one population, and then a physical barrier separates that population into two. So that means there's no gene flow. What gene flow is the movement of traits from one population to another. So the movement of traits or genes from one population to another isn't occurring. So we already talked about natural selection, but let's say we had this bunny species, and it's white with regular standard ears. So we have some kind of geographic isolation that separates the two species, making them no longer able to flow genes from back and forth. And let's say on each side of this river, there's different environmental conditions. And these organisms develop different mutations, and because their environments are different, natural selection is selecting different traits. And through time, eventually, many generations, they end up developing different traits. So as you could see it by the end, this rabbit remains white and has floppy ears, where this rabbit becomes gray and keeps the traditional ears. So because of natural selection and that isolation of different environments, they were able to diverge into two separate species. And if you were try to reconnect this population, they would no longer be able to breed. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. However, but creating a species isn't always something that happens because of a geographic isolation. It can also happen when two populations are in the same area. So how does that happen? So basically that happens when a population ends up inhabiting or having a different niche. So here you see there's two fruit fly species. They're in the same area, but this fruit fly population is only looking at these red apples, and this one is only looking at these green apples. And because these populations are occupying a different niche, eventually they are remaining separate and they have different adaptations that natural selection is selecting for. Eventually they will diverge into a separate species after many, many generations and many years. So let's talk about reproductive isolation. So this is something that once a species diverges is keeping those species separated. So it's when the breeding between two populations is not successful. So they are not able to successfully produce a viable offspring, which is the definition of a species. So that's what's keeping those species separate. So there's two types of this, something called prezygotic and postzygotic. So prezygotic is any type of barrier that prevents two populations from producing offspring before birth. So any barrier that is preventing that breeding before birth. Postzygotic is anything that's preventing that breeding either during development or after birth. So pre, before, post, after. So in most species, they utilize the prezygotic isolation. And there's many ways they do this. So first and most obvious is geographic isolation. So if they're physically separated, chances are they're not going to breed. So for example, this species was one species, it diverged. So they got a separated barrier, they diverged into two separate species, and once they're put back together, they're only breeding with their own kind. Same thing with habitat isolation. They could be in the same area, they're inhabiting different niches, so they're not really coming in contact very often with one another. Something called temporal isolation. So temporal isolation is when you're either breeding at different times of the year or you're breeding at different times of the day. Something called behavioral isolation. So this is when you have different breeding behavior, so different mating calls, let's say, or different mating routines or rituals. So for example, let's say a bird. So birds have different songs. So a bird can only recognize its own song. So birds of different species with different songs wouldn't be able to pick up a mate that doesn't have their same song. They can't recognize it, so they won't be able to breed. And this is something just really cute in the Galapagos Islands. So blue-footed boobies actually do this special dance with their feet to attract a mate. So this blue-footed booby would not be able to attract a different species of booby, for example, a Nazca booby, because they have a different behavior, a different dance. So there's something called mechanical isolation. Basically what that means is their two parts don't fit together correctly. They have different parts, so they can't breed. And if all else fails, there's something called gametic isolation. And that's when basically the body actually rejects so the female egg cell actually physically rejects that sperm cell. So they are not able to be fertilized from each other. It sees it as a virus and it gets rid of it, or a bacteria and gets rid of it. It's like an invader. So these are all prezygotic isolation techniques, so mechanisms before birth. So postzygotic isolation is basically they're able to actually breed, but either their offspring comes out inviable, so it dies either during birth, it dies shortly after birth, or their offspring is not fertile itself. So the same thing we saw with the liger. So these are postzygotic isolation techniques, so after birth. So we've talked about how species can diverge naturally through usually natural selection, but there's another way that species have kind of evolved through time, and so it's something called artificial selection. So this is when humans are breeding different species with desired traits to get a certain result. The most common example of this is dog breeding. So many years ago, we had a traditional wolf, and these wolves were breeded based on their certain traits, and we're able to get all these different dog breeds. Now, they're not different species, but if we kept doing this after many generations and generations over time, perhaps we can get a different species that won't choose to breed together. So what do I mean by this? So let's say this big dog here, I think it's a dachshund, I'm not sure, but let's say we have this dachshund and we have this chihuahua, and we put them on an island together, two different populations. So put dachshund population and a chihuahua population. Now, even though they are the same species and they can breed, chances are this chihuahua doesn't want to breed with this dachshund. It's way too big. They'll probably breed with their own kind, and they'll also probably inhabit a different niche. Because the chihuahua is so small, it probably eats kind of smaller prey like maybe a mice or an insect, where a dachshund can eat something bigger like a rabbit or lizards or something like that. So maybe through time, many generations, these two dog breeds can become separate species if time is given. So we've talked about a lot in this video. Let's go over some of the key points. So the key points of this presentation were: the species is a group of organisms that produces fertile offspring. Speciation results from reproductive isolation. Allopatric isolation involves species developing during a physical isolation, whereas sympatric isolation occurs when organisms have different niches. Reproductive isolation prevents an organism of a different species from producing fertile offspring. And artificial selection over time may lead to the development of a new species. So I hope you guys learned something today. Bye guys.